Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Anti-Corruption Crusader podcast. This podcast is about interviewing professionals and distinguished guests that are expert in the ethics, good governance, and anti-corruption field. We hope that this podcast will help inspire others to come on board and help with the mission that we have, which is to make the society and the world more transparent, more ethical, and organizations full of organizations that can run with good governance, less corruption. My guest here today is Steve Tosh. He is an expert in the field of procurement, fraud, and corruption investigation, as well as risk mitigation. He has over 25 years experience in this field. He's also the lead author in help drafting the British Standards BS 10501. What that is a guidance on implementing procurement frauds and control. He's also an author of a book called The Procurement Fraud and Corruption, How to Identify and Mitigate Procurement Fraud Risk. I believe currently he's the company director of the Global Risk Alliance, which specializes in training and coaching on fraud detection. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you very much for the invitation to speak to you today, Pat. It's greatly appreciated. And like you
Well, it's
said, to
an,
spread the word on procurement fraud and corruption, which is great.
it's an honor to have you. And I follow you on LinkedIn a lot, and the content that you share is very helpful in the procurement and fraud detection world. So, other than what I told the audience about yourself, can you tell the audience a little bit about your journey on how you come about into this field of expertise?
Sure. In some respects, I actually stumbled into the area. I've come from a law enforcement background, and I didn't enjoy the first part of my career, so I stepped into criminal investigations, which I really enjoyed. But in actual fact, I got moved into, or at least um, I suppose I got moved into procurement fraud, in particular, a larger fraud squad in law enforcement, and I really enjoyed it. The protracted and complicated nature of contract fraud and corruption, and these types of cases can take years to investigate and never mind prosecute. I actually enjoyed it more than I enjoyed the normal day-to-day criminal investigations. So that's where I started, and really, for the next sort of 15 years, I was in and around that environment, whether it's financial investigation or intelligence. And then I headed an anti-corruption capability towards the ending of my career. That's what I did, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. We worked with a lot of international partners, organizations like the FBI, a number of other American agencies, investigated contract fraud in UK and international in areas like Iraq and Afghanistan. So it was really interesting. I found it fascinating. But after sort of 22 years, in some respect, I stopped enjoying the nature of police work, and I felt I was pushed in a different direction. So I actually stepped into the private sector, working for myself, and I've done that in a number of roles now. Um, as a company UK, I was in the Dubai for 3 years, working in the Middle East and Central Asia, and more recently, certainly since 2019, I've moved back to UK, set up my own company, and I've been doing different types of work around anti-money laundering, around corruption investigation and education from a public sector, private sector, but more recently from a international development perspective. That's been my sort of key focus on West Africa in particular. So just to give you a sort of snapshot of what I've been doing, really.
Wow, that's
Just a
intriguing
few
and
things. Yeah.
incredible as well. You know, your background and experience reminds me of a movie called The International. I don't know if you've seen it. Is it like that?
Okay.
Are you the
No.
Clive Owen of the International movie?
I'm not sure. It's been a challenging journey, but very enjoyable from a, you know, think if you're in anti-corruption, you enjoy the learning of it because, I would never call myself an expert just purely because you're always learning. There's always something new the criminals are, your knowledge is only as good as the new technique that the criminals have brought out, and the various, for instance, in money laundering, there's so many different techniques that can be used now. So you're always learning. And
Hmm.
every country has got a different methodology, way of doing business, way of doing contracting. So it's all different. So that's what I enjoy about it. And ultimately, for me, it's imparting that knowledge. So to see the difference in other individuals, that's satisfaction for me, to make a change in other organizations, or at least those individuals making change themselves. That's the satisfaction for me there.
Perfect, perfect. I'm just curious to know, in your line of work in fraud detection or risk management, what's the biggest misconception, sorry, about the procurement fraud and corruption?
Yeah. Probably many, really. I mean, one of the big ones, there are many, certainly, it's sometimes it's the word procurement, because there's an association that the people who commit procurement fraud, they're people who work within procurement. That's sort of one of them. I mean, although there are many cases, however, when you look at the contracting process, if you like, the definition is from the identification of needs through to the end of life of a contract and the disposal. There are so many individuals around involved in the decision making. There are so many individuals involved in the organisation of the procurement, and ultimately, if you look at things like stealing to order as an example, or in the disposal process, where many most organizations don't look at the asset management side of business, whether that's public sector or private sector. Their control measures are at the tender side of things, the procurement. But actually, once they're in the organization, you can have significant theft and corruption. Some of the biggest corruption cases I've dealt with has been in the disposal. So I think that's some respect, because you can have things like, you can have civil engineers, project managers. Who is the end user? Is it an executive, or in the decision making, do politicians get involved? So it's such a broad array of potentials around corruption, around ultimately I call the insider threat. That's the challenge in any organisation, risk assessing their corruption and procurement fraud risk, is where does the threat come from? And it can come from anywhere, really.
So if the fraud or the corruption involves, a whole host of stakeholders, a whole host of process and approvals and oversight, how would you recommend to organization, where do they focus on if they have, limited resources?
Personally, I would focus on anywhere. I mean, if you're going to focus on one area to try and identify the risk, I would actually start at the payment process,
Mm.
personally, and then, because when for instance, from an audit perspective or a data analysis perspective, when you see the patterns, or you can identify the patterns, then you can work your way back through the procurement process to see why there was the fraud within the payment process. And is it a case of a fictitious requirement, as an example, that's been created? And I'll give you one example. A client asked us to. They knew they had a bribery risk, but they didn't know where. So we had to look at. I started off by looking at advance payments, and I also looked at change of bank accounts and compared the two. And if you have a change of bank account by a contractor, you should only get one or two a year. You should get many, but this organisation had hundreds, and of those, a lot of the payments were actually paid into personal bank accounts. So once you have that fraud, you know you've got fraud. You can then work your way back into the procurement process, then have a look at how did they do it, and look at all whether it's through the procurement route, the tender selection, or actually the false invoicing or whatever, or the fictitious requirement. How did they do it? And that will identify all the individuals involved in the process and the decision making around that. So that's just one example. But personally, if you're going into an organization, or you have just started at an organization and you don't know where your corruption risk is, you really have to risk assess the whole organization as far as the procurement, its projects, as an example. Because one of the things that as I like to do in my training courses is, teach the methodologies of procurement, fraud, and corruption, and then take a live project, the one that are currently running or they're just about to start, and then take it through from the identification of need and all the decision making around there through to the end of life. And if you have the key stakeholders like project managers, procurement, quality assurance, the key decision makers, then it allows you to identify where all the key fraud risks might be. And then you can put in mitigation. So it's not a case of starting at one place. I think you've got to look at the whole organisation. Procurement is just one part, but you can have quality assurance, maintenance. It just depends on your organisation and what the operations are of an organisation, of where you might want to target that risk. You know,
Right.
so
So,
it's a broad
so
statement.
right. So I guess, you have to look everywhere, but essentially start following the money. That's what you're saying, right?
Absolutely, and that's right because ultimately, it, it's one of those areas where you cultivate. You're talking about insider threat. It's identifying where the weaknesses are in your controls because the insider knows where your weaknesses are.
Hmm. Is it?
That's the key.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, no, that's the for me. That's always the key point. It's one of the
Right.
reasons why, as an example, I always, coming from a law enforcement background and all the many investigations we have done, we had a sort of methodology of how we did it, really. But in actual fact, when you go into an organization cold, if you like, and try to identify, one of the things I always like to do is put a procurement expert in it and then say, right, tell me where there's non-compliance with the procurement process. What they're doing right for policy and what they're doing wrong. And
Right.
when you identify what they're doing wrong, that's when you can drill down to see whether there's something nefarious there, whether it's actually corruption or whether just bad practice. And in a lot of
Right.
cases, it's corruption.
Right.
So that's what I like to do, not throw in investigators, because investigators don't necessarily understand the procurement process.
Mm.
But a procurement expert will know it, same as a finance expert will know how finance should be done. So it's when there's these changes, it's like, right, why are these, this non-compliance? And then you can drill down to it. So that's the simple methodology that I like to take. And it is
Right. Right.
successful.
That's very good. Thank you. Very helpful. I'm just
Pleasure.
curious to know, and I think the audience would be interested as well. Was there any memorable audits or events in the past where uncovered
I can speak
deeply
about.
deeply hidden red flags that you can share that might be helpful to the auditors or compliance officers listening, without mentioning any names, of course. I
Yes.
appreciate you can share
I mean,
some examples.
it's not necessarily the red flags. When it comes to audit, it's not necessarily the red flags. It's how you use the audit information.
Mm,
I'll give you a number of examples. We were brought into in a government organisation, and we were brought into. There was a bribery allegation, and it was around the consultancy contract, and or at least it was a large project, an ICT project that was basically around connecting IT infrastructure together. So they had a project team that once they got the requirement there, they had to then go out and identify key experts who could be brought in around IT and consultancy to do the work for whatever that requirement was. But what an individual did was he had the notification early, and what he did was he set up his own recruitment company. So he was because he got the notice early. His wife, who was the owner, went out and identified the consultant and then brought them in preparation for this consultancy. Very simple, very simple fraud. Interesting. But so, but what happened? So that case was dealt with. But what I didn't know at the time was there was actually an audit being carried out because they had their own single source direct award process for all this consultancy, and there was an audit of the process. And the audit findings demonstrated that the process wasn't working. It wasn't used correctly. They had an audit. They had an oversight board for the single source justifications that wasn't used correctly, and when it
mhm,
was used, it was done badly. We were never made aware of that. I found out about a year later when it was actually published in the press, believe it or
mhm,
not. And that's how I found out, which after the investigation was completed. Because
mhm,
if I was aware of that as an investigator, that might have changed my complete focus on my investigation, made it broader.
mhm, mhm,
So I think a lot of the problems and I'll give you another example. I was actually doing a training course, and this international, sorry, global organization. I was conducting a training course in London, and I had procurement managers there, audit, investigations, and a number of other project managers. And one of the procurement managers said they just had an audit in one of the regions, and it highlighted that 60% of the invoices audited were inflated from all the
Mhm.
suppliers. That information wasn't passed on to investigations. I mean, they would have looked to recover the money. However, how much of that is criminal?
Mhm.
You know, how much of that is fraud or insider threat? That's, for me, that's one of the problems with audits and organizations is I sort of write about it, and having a like a centralized decision-making group around all reports coming into the organization or within it. So key stakeholders can make decisions, whether that's head of procurement, head of HR, investigations, the executive, projects, or legal, and audit themselves. Who are your key stakeholders that allow the decision making and change management in your own organization? And that's what I don't see.
Mhm.
And I'll give you a really good example. There was an audit. We were brought in for a bribery case at another company, and we were asked to look at the extent of the fraud in the organisation and how it might broaden. And we were aware that an audit had been done previously, about a year earlier, but we deliberately didn't look at it straight away because we didn't want it to divert us from our key approach. So we eventually looked at it after a number of weeks, and the previous audit, which was by a well-known auditor, highlighted fraud in the organisation. But the audit wasn't for fraud; it was just for procurement as a whole, I think. But fraud was highlighted, but it never drilled down into it. But the fraudsters, because they were aware of this audit report, persuaded the executive to resolve the fraud issue, to actually to purchase another procurement system. So basically, the old procurement system highlighted the fraud was closed off, so they could be detected, and then they created a new system where they carried on committing the fraud. So the organisation, their mindset had mitigated fraud, but in actual fact they hadn't. It's how we use the decision making around the audit reports. That's key. It's not the red flags necessarily. It's how we use the decision making around it. And I think that's, for me, that's the most important sort of thing.
Right. I agree with you also. What we also do here in Thailand is that there's a lot of corruption around government procurement. And to, illustrate what you just told the audience, a lot of the corruption happens outside the procurement process or before the procurement process.
Yeah,
For
exactly.
example, the bidders would be colluding long before the bidding starts,
Yep.
or the chosen suppliers that are corrupted with the officials have a
Yep.
hand in writing the TOR, which
Yep.
sways to their favor. How do
Yep.
we prevent these type of off-process kind of corruption and fraud, Steve?
It is. It's a real challenge. It is one of those things, and it is the problem with, not the problem. It's the risk in procurement systems where individuals say we've got a procurement system, therefore our fraud is reduced, and we leave it. We're not proactive in nature, and I think being proactive is the key point. Is because when you look at the procurement process, which I've talked about, you've got your identification. Who identifies the requirement, the need? Who creates the business case, the authorization, the justification around that, the specification of it, um, the budget itself? How do you formulate and justify the budget? These areas are not on the procurement system, and this is where the fraud and corruption planning happens. And this is the key point. One of the interesting, and you raise a really good point, is that I had a conversation with an individual. He was involved with a well-known consultancy firm, and they were looking at, or they are looking at creating a a risk identification piece of software for organizations, or particularly for anti-corruption agencies, so they can actively. So, for instance, when you look at things like the risks from politically exposed persons or executives in budget creation, national budget creation, where a ministry, department, or agency creates this budget because they might have a project or a number of projects. So they create this fiction of a budget, but then that will go into uh, government to then look at, or whatever the structure is of the national governance is, then you'll have individuals that review it. And this is sometimes where the PEP gets involved, is that's the fact we want to inflate that because I want to get involved in that area of the project. But what you have is two different figures or a number of different figures. And that's where the data, for me, the data analysis comes in. So organizations like the anti-corruption agencies can then proactively look at budgets from how it was created, and then what is the new figure before it goes out. So you're proactively looking at these figures, and at the very least, you're identifying parts of government or public sector that are a high risk of corruption because the figures have dramatically changed. So at the very least, agencies then can proactively monitor the corruption risk within the relevant public sector.
Right.
Because when it comes to data analysis, you know, it's one of those key decisions, isn't it? It's at the planning stage, the decision will be made around who the company's going to win the contract, and either how are we going to receive the bribe, the kickback, or how are we going to move the monies, throughout the lifetime of a project or contract. So the methodology has already been arranged right at the planning stage before we even get onto the procurement system. So it's how we identify that. And for me, one of the key elements is simply the verification that the goods, works, or services have been provided. Because so when you get a contract or an invoice in, there should be a requisition there. There should be a purchase order contract, and there should be an invoice. But what doesn't happen is there should be independent verification that the work was actually provided, and
Mhm.
that's it before payments gets made. And that's how you identify the fraud, to see whether there is a fictitious requirement in there, or
Right.
the work was never carried out, but it was authorised by, say, a project manager because they were already given a kickback. So
Right.
there's a number of ways where data analysis and audit as well. The crossover is the same really. It's how that can be targeted within projects or any high value procurement to identify the insider threat.
Right. I see. So it's coming back to your personal journey a bit. I want to maybe ask if someone is, either looking into, working in your field of expertise or someone who's already working in such role, how would you, see the future changes, with implications from AI or
All right.
social media or technology in general?
It's interesting. I'm not ahead of the game on this one without a doubt, but certainly from the perspective of one of the challenges there is with not it's not a challenge with AI with technology is as I've already mentioned is where's the data held around the justification, identification of need, the plan that planning part that isn't on the electronic systems. That's where that's where the AI for me, has to move into if we're going to collect all the data and look at the patterns, is to have that information that isn't there, not just the procurement data or the spend data, which is the key areas to show the patterns, and that will highlight methodology and patterns and a risk without a doubt, and it will fine tune and get better without a doubt. But it's the before, for me, one of the areas is the before stuff that isn't on the system. How do we
Mhm.
move that onto the system? And I think once we have that, you will reduce the corruption risk because that planning stage, which I've talked about, isn't on the system. Because corruption is in the dark, isn't it? As we say, it's the corruption and decision makers nowhere near the conversation, nowhere near the payment system. They're away
Right.
from the organisation. So how do we move it towards the organisation so we can then look at the various patterns? Because there's a lot of solutions now where you can scan data into systems, although it can be quite intensive.
Right. Right.
But there's a lot of ways you can do that. Solutions are out there, but there's no one system that will put it together because it's a huge cost.
Right.
So that's the challenge is having a system that can reduce the costs are reduced in buying the system in the first place, and that is a financial benefit to from a national perspective.
I see. Wow, we're almost out of time, and I'm sure that I have a lot more questions to what you just told the audience, and I'm sure the audience would like to ask some questions as well. But if they wanted to get a hold of you, how do they do that?
I mean, obviously, my company is Global Risk Alliance, and you can contact me through there. But I'm really active on LinkedIn, as you know, Hannah. And I'm open to particular people who are interested in anti-corruption or procurement fraud. I'll always connect because and it's one of the reasons why I share so much on LinkedIn. I try to do it 3 or 4 times a week is because for me, I want to build the community. Like to me, that's really important. Because there's so many parts of it. It's not just a case of you know there's one type of person that's involved in anti-corruption. There's so many sectors that someone in finance or procurement could be have an interest. So there's no one type of person that's involved. So build that community, and then everybody sharing the knowledge, for free ultimately, can only be a great thing. And you have that because there's so much negativity globally around corruption and everything else that to build the community and create that positive and momentum for me is really important.
Right. Okay, fantastic. And sorry, we're about out of time. So, Stephen Tosh, the Anti-Corruption Crusader, thank you so much for being on my podcast. And we look forward to maybe having another conversation somewhere in the future. Thanks
Thanks,
very
mate. Much
much.
appreciated. Thanks for your time.